Sondra, welcome again, and just lovely to have a first-hand report from the land as always, and much has been happening, much that hasn't been real good happening, isn't it? But I'll let you tell us more. Okay, bless you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody, or good evening, depending on what part of the world you're in right now. So what we try to do in these monthly updates is kind of do a bit of this and a bit of that. I do want to bring you an update from Israel in the sense of what is the news talking about these days? What are some of our concerns? And then, of course, take us into, well, one of the things that Joy and Marion suggested that we do today is kind of share a little bit about, choose a community and share about that community, kind of give you, without you actually being there, kind of a sense of what it's like to live in a place, who are the people. And so we'll do a bit of that as well. And then we'll end up with a short thought from the Bible that's relevant for today. Okay, so let's start with the update. There are two issues that are been most on our minds in Israel recently, other than the pandemic, of course, which is just too boring a topic, so we're not going to discuss it. But the two major issues, of course, is that we've seen a rise in terrorism on the one hand, and on the other hand, the threat of Iran seems to be growing and is actually dominating the concern of the security establishment in Israel. So first of all, let me just say a few words about the recent terrorist attacks. Over the last few weeks alone, there were a number of individual attacks against people. There was a fellow, for example, that was crossing the street in Jerusalem, just outside the old city. And, he's on one side of the street and he's in the crosswalk and he's crossing, and a guy on the other side of the street comes towards him. And initially he thinks, it's just somebody crossing the same crosswalk in the opposite direction. And then this fellow pulls out a knife and starts stabbing him, and of course it's an Arab terrorist. Oh, thank God there were military right nearby. There's what they call border police, which is kind of quasi-military, quasi-police. And they were there right on the scene and were able to neutralize this terrorist. The fellow who was stabbed, thank God, was not too seriously hurt. He was in the hospital and then he was released, and he will be fine. Unfortunately, there's been, all kinds of incidents. I'm sure you've read about a lot of these other stabbing attacks, different kinds of things like that. There's one attack that I'm sure you haven't heard about because it really didn't make the news, but just in my own neighborhood, the main road that leads from my community out going west or east, so just west of here, the road actually doesn't go into any Arab communities anymore. It used to, but now it's just a proper highway. And so on the highway, just in the middle of the road, all of a sudden a car rams into an Israeli car. Okay, so what do you normally do? You pull to the side, you get out, you check the damage, the other person gets out, you exchange details, right? And so that was her assumption. She gets out of the car. Well, it turns out the person who had rammed her was a terrorist. Okay, he was an Arab in a car. He rams into her. She gets out of the car. He gets out of his car, beats her up, and drives off in her car. So, and so you could say, well, okay, it wasn't a serious terrorist attack. He certainly was not there to kill her. Okay, he didn't have a knife. He didn't have a gun. He didn't beat her silly. He was there to intimidate her, scare her, and to interrupt normal life. And so you have both of these kinds of activities going on, where you have, on the one hand, terrorist activities that are really dangerous, where people are trying to kill Jews. And on the other hand, you have these other sorts of things that are, annoying, dangerous, scary, okay, but serious nonetheless. And so that's happening. And at the same time, what we see is I I've talked about this or I've written about this, but I do want to mention it. There was one terrorist attack that, to me, touched me more than anything. Unfortunately, a young 26-year-old man was murdered. Okay, his name was Eli K. And he grew up in South Africa and Johannesburg. And when he was a young man, just finishing high school, he decided that he wanted to move to Israel. He was a Zionist, and he was a religious man, a Zionist, and he just felt that this is where every good Jew needs to be. And he moved to Israel by himself. He spent some time studying in a yeshiva, in a Bible school in Israel, strengthening his faith and his understanding of Jewish sources and the Bible. And then he went into the army, and he was so proud to be able to serve his country in this significant way. At some point, his whole family moved to Israel. As a result of his dedication and his moving to Israel, the entire family, his parents, his siblings, they all came. And then, in fact, recently, his brother got married, and he himself had a serious girlfriend. He was living in a small community, kibbutz, just outside of Gaza, and it was really part of his desire to strengthen an area of Israel that he felt was vulnerable and needed people to be there. And he worked in Jerusalem. He was a tour guide at the Western Wall and the area of that old area of the old city of Jerusalem, showing people around, explaining to them, about the Jewish history of Jerusalem. Unfortunately, one morning, just 2 weeks ago, he was walking back from prayers in the morning and walking towards where he would do his job in the Western Wall administrative buildings, and he was killed, murdered by a terrorist. Who was this terrorist? He was a Muslim preacher. In other words, not just an Arab. He was a serious religious Muslim affiliated with Hamas, who was a religious preacher and was a teacher in a city school. In other words, the Arab residents of Jerusalem have different schools. They have a public school system the same way the Jews do, but it's schools that are run in Arabic, and it's a wonderful thing, that the Arabs can go to school in Arabic and the Jews can go to school in Hebrew, and all that is good. And it's a city school, and he was paid by the city of Jerusalem for his job as a teacher in the school. But you can only imagine what he was teaching. After the murder, they discovered, I think the security forces knew about him already and had been following him, but it turns out he's preaching jihad. He's preaching hatred of the Jews. This is who this guy was. A guy who received his salary from the city of Jerusalem has been preaching all this stuff, and who knows what he was preaching to the kids that he was teaching in school. But this was who the terrorist was. I don't know. To me, I was so. Oh wait, I have to turn off my phone. 1 second. Sorry about that. To me, I was so touched by this whole thing. Of course, it was such a tragedy, and to see this family devastated in such a way. The parents who had just recently moved to Israel, whose son had just gotten married, and they had such a wonderful time with this wedding. And yet to hear the family talk about their commitment to Israel, their commitment to God, their knowledge that whatever happened, it's in God's hands. It was just overwhelming to hear a family like this and to see how they were dealing with this tragedy in such a brave and impressive way, I have to say. So that's been going on.
Sondra, we heard Eliyahu studied in Australia too, at a yeshiva here.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, our Jewish community knew him and honored him.
Oh, I did not know that. Okay, well, thank you for adding that a little bit. Around the same time that all of this stuff has been going on, again, we haven't been able to say that we're looking at a new intifada or that we suddenly have, major uprisings or armed struggle or anything like that. These have been individual attacks that have been on the rise. However, around the same time, the IDF discovered quite significant Hamas infrastructure throughout Judea and Samaria. These are cells, terrorist cells operating under the leadership of Hamas, which is illegal, not just illegal because Israel doesn't like it, but the Palestinian Authority doesn't like it either. They see Hamas as a major threat to them. And this is the one thing that the Palestinian Authority and Israel have in common, the common enemy of Hamas. And so all these people were rounded up, and they discovered through this operation that, in fact, Hamas had far more significant reach and resources and strategic assets in Judea and Samaria that had been previously thought. If I connect all these dots, we then see this week there were some major marches like there was one in Shechem, a big Arab city here in Samaria, where a major march, demonstration, whatever, with Hamas flags and people openly identifying with Hamas, which, as I said, both the Palestinian Authority and Israel doesn't like. The Palestinian Authority actually broke up this demonstration quite violently. But what we are seeing is the Hamas is definitely getting bolder, and it's very possible that they're getting more support locally. My sense, if I'm going to read the map, like what's going on here in the Arab world, on the Palestinian side of things, I would say you have a split society. You have some people that, particularly the ones that are more religiously inclined, that are under the Hamas influence and are definitely, even if they're not taken, and they say, we hate the Jews, you're only here temporarily, we can't wait to get rid of you, just get out of here. And they'll say that very openly, okay? On the other hand, just a few weeks ago, I went to there's an industrial park near Ariel called the Barkan Industrial Park, and it has quite a number of factories there where Jews and Arabs work together. I went into one of them. It's one of my favorite. It's called Untitled Chapter, and it's one of my favorite because it produces cakes, and I love sweets. And so they have the best, gooeyest cakes. And when you go there, like they always give me stuff, cookies and cakes and gooey things. Anyway, so I was there, and there they have Arabs from Qalqilia, for the most part, who have been working there for many years. They love it there. They are well treated. When you ask them, how they feel about all this stuff, they're saying all they want is peace and quiet. When they work in Israeli companies, they make a good salary. They're well treated by the employers. They have real relationships. And I actually had someone with me. There was a Dutch fellow, a Dutch Christian fellow, head of an organization that we work very closely with in Holland, Christians for Israel. He snuck into Israel, in those few weeks when it was open to tourists before it got closed down again. So he was able to come in at that time, and I was taking him around to show him some things. And when he was there, he saw how I'm joking with these Arab workers. And, I was joking about I was asking this guy, how do you keep your weight down when you're surrounded by all this whipped cream and, stuff like that. And he came out of that and he says, this is something we never see. There is real potential for peace. And there really is, because there's a lot of good people there who really just want to be left alone. They don't like the Palestinian Authority because the Palestinian Authority doesn't do anything for them. They're corrupt, and they're just looking after their own interest. But at the same time, we have this other group of people that are infested with the worst hatred and inciting towards violence. And the question is, which of these groups are going to prevail? And I can tell you that the only way the bad guys are going to prevail is if we let them prevail. We have to constantly be on our guard and make sure that there's no tolerance for this kind of behavior. And unfortunately, we don't always see that kind of attitude coming from countries around the world. And that is, of course, something that we were very encouraged by the way that Great Britain did declare that Hamas is illegal. That's a good step. We need to see a lot more of that. We also, and believe me, the Palestinian Authority are not the good guys here, not at all. And people that are funding their activities, even if when they're not funding terrorism, they're funding activities that are very problematic. This is part of the problem, but that's another issue. Okay, so that's the terrorism issue. I also want to touch briefly on Iran. Iran is a huge problem, much bigger problem than the local terrorism. Iran, it turns out, is very, very close to being able to enrich uranium to a very high quality. Once they are able to do that, the next step would be for them to actually create the way to carry a bomb. In other words, we know they're already very, very close to producing the uranium that is needed for an atomic bomb. Then how close are they to being able to carry that bomb, to building the appropriate missile to carry that bomb? That is something that we don't really know yet. And it is assumed that that would take a little bit more time, but it still is of grave concern. Now, the problem here, of course, is what has been going on with the Americans. And in Israel, there's an ongoing debate to what extent we need to be relying on the Americans, making decisions with respect to the Americans, what our attitude needs to be. When Obama was president, he entered into this terrible, terrible nuclear deal. The argument that Obama and his administration put forward was that by entering into the deal, this would slow them down from reaching nuclear whatever, and that would be a good thing. Unfortunately, what they did was they released all this enormous funds, which first of all enabled Iran to put even more money into some of its other activities, supporting terrorism, supporting what's going on in Syria, which creates a huge, huge threat to Israel, but also to other countries. Also, it's not clear at all that they slowed down that much, under that deal. Trump came along and, to Israel's relief, pulled the United States out of that deal. And imposed heavy sanctions, which actually were very crippling to Iran. That was a very good thing. Unfortunately, two things, though, seem to have happened in the meantime. Number one, Biden is now president, and they are in negotiations with Iran. They very much want a deal with Iran. And the Iranians seem to be extremely arrogant in their approach to the whole deal. They just want all the sanctions removed, and they have the sense that the United States is so eager to enter into a deal that they won't have to give up much at all of anything in order to have these sanctions removed. But at the same time, what has become clear that even though that when Trump canceled the nuclear deal, at the same time, nothing was done to watch and to see what was going on in Iran in the meantime. Iran, not feeling at all bound by any agreement, whether a good or a bad agreement, started developing forward on its nuclear process before. In Israel, there is tremendous criticism and debate. Okay, the current government, Bennett, has criticized Netanyahu significantly and blamed him for relying on the United States to fight our battle. That basically Netanyahu had succeeded in convincing Trump to withdraw from the agreement. The issue is, what are we supposed to do with the United States, and to what extent are we supposed to be acting on our own? It seems that Netanyahu's policy was to really rely on the United States. So he got Trump to cancel U.S. participation in the nuclear agreement, which was wonderful, and imposition of sanctions. But the question was anything done then to continue monitoring Iran and prevent them from moving forward? Iran, it seems, took advantage of not being bound by this agreement to gallop forward in its development of its nuclear program. Okay, so canceling the treaty is a good thing, but at the same time, steps need to be taken to prevent Iran from moving forward, and it seems that was not done, not by the United States and not significantly by Israel either. At least that is what Bennett is now claiming. And I don't know. I'm not behind the scenes. I don't work for the Mossad, so I can't tell you. But from what we're reading and what we're seeing, there is certainly a very real fear, because indeed Israel has come much Iran has come much closer to this nuclear capability than ever before. What is becoming a consensus in Israel is that Israel cannot rely on the United States. If relying on the United States seemed possibly feasible under Trump, when Trump himself seemed at least to have similar goals to Israel in stopping Trump, today, although Biden has declared he does not want a nuclear Iran, he will not allow a nuclear Iran, there's a few things that lead us to concern. One is the way they seem to be carrying forward on these Vienna talks. The United States and Iran are not even in the same room. The whole situation is extremely demeaning to the United States. And why the United States hasn't just gotten up and walked out of the room by now is puzzling. But what it does is then it gives encouragement to Iran that they can continue mocking the United States and get away with it. Of course, especially when you're dealing with the Middle East, things having to do with dignity and honor are essential. They're not just decorative. Okay, they're essential parts of all diplomacy. There are three things that are of major concern to the Israeli military establishment today. One is that if we look at what happened in Afghanistan a few months ago, when the United States rapidly pulled out, leaving behind people who had been allies of the United States, individuals, leaving them at the mercy of the Taliban, that indicates to the entire Middle East, those particularly who are American allies, Gulf states, for example, that they cannot rely on the United States because the Biden administration doesn't have a problem betraying their own allies. That's number one. Number two, the United States decided not to respond. On October 20th, there was an Iranian attack against a U.S. airbase in Syria. And the United States did not respond to that attack, sending a message to Iran that they could get away with this. And thirdly, again, what I started by saying is that what we're seeing in Vienna, the way the talks are going on, is that seems to be a message going out there from the Americans that they are so eager to reach a deal, any deal, that they are not standing up for what are the most important interests. Israel today, and this would encompass all parts of Israel, right and left and center, is determined to not allow, to do whatever it takes to prevent Iran from reaching this nuclear capability. And if that means going on our own, I think that is what they're saying. I'm not sure the decisions will be that simple, because going on your own may well be doing something against the United States. But I have to remind you that it was back in 1981 when Menachem Begin, who was then Prime Minister of Israel, authorized the attack on the Iraqi nuclear facility that was just getting going in Usirik. And that was a move that was very strongly criticized by the United States at that time. But in the end, years later, when the United States was at war with Iraq, with Saddam Hussein, they were extremely grateful that in the meantime, Iraq had not developed nuclear capability. So, sometimes we have to take the criticism, but at the end of the day, I do believe that whatever Israel is doing is not just for the good of Israel.
Sondra,
but it's for, yes?
Sondra, could I make a comment? Because
Sure.
historically, there is a precedent. 1938 in Munich before the Second World War, the word is appeasement.
Right.
Try to appease. We could almost see a parallel here.
Right, no question. I would say, though, that while Obama was clearly speaking the language of appeasement, Biden speaks that language less when he actually says something, okay? Unfortunately, some of his actions and the way he's carrying things out does reflect appeasement. My sense about Biden, by the way, I don't think he's a bad guy, but I think he is not very competent. And so that is really where some of our fears are coming from. He doesn't, I just get the sense he doesn't get it, He'll get up and say, oh, we have your back, Israel. We're not going to allow Iran to have nuclear capabilities, and don't worry. And, and he says all the right things, but then the way he leads the administration's policy is the opposite. And I sometimes wonder, either he's a good liar, which is possible, or he just doesn't get it. He doesn't get what operating in the Middle East is all about. Okay, so I leave that.
Yeah, we saw what he did. I mean, you mentioned what he did in Afghanistan recently. I don't think he's particularly competent. That's the trouble. I don't think.
Yeah, but that's the thing. In other words, even when he was talking about Afghanistan as it was going on, he just was bumbling about. He didn't come out and say, oh, we're doing it for this reason, It was just like a mess. It was like, really? That's what was going to happen? Oh my, So it makes you feel like this is a world leader. This is a guy that we're supposed to have confidence in. I don't think he would have. He never wanted to see people dropping off of airplanes. That wasn't what he wanted. But he ended up being there, kind of saying, how did we get there? And that's what's, I think, more frightening about Biden. But anyway, enough of all that stuff. Let's turn to just I wanted to focus today on the community of Othniel. I was in Othniel just a few weeks ago, and it's just a lovely community. Have any of you been to Othniel? Okay, well, we got to get you there. Othniel is a very small community. Well, it's not tiny. It's about 150 families. Othniel's been around for a long time, and is not one of these newer communities, an outpost or anything like that. It was founded back in 1983, which was when most of the established communities in Judea and Samaria were established. In those years between 1982 and 1984 was when the bulk of the communities were established. That was right when Menachem Begin was prime minister, up until beginning. It was like the last few years of Menachem Begin's reign as prime minister, and it was a major government policy to establish communities. Now, Othniel is located, and this is what makes this community so special. First of all, biblically, it is located along the ancient route that Abraham walked when he walked from Hebron to Beersheba. It is on that ancient route, and it's the name Othniel is named for the first judge, Othniel, the son of Kenaz, and Othniel, the son of Kenaz, actually was Caleb's son-in-law. And Caleb offered this particular area, which was called Dvir, to whoever would conquer it. And Othniel was a good soldier, and he conquered the area, and he gave it to him. And then the story tells us also that he gave a nearby springs to his daughter, who was Othniel's wife. And that is the exact area where the community of Othniel is located. And of course, that's why it's named Othniel. Started with just a few families in an isolated area. But this, again, was before we knew about intifadas. It was isolated, okay, but there wasn't violence and there wasn't crazy things going on. It was difficult in that you didn't have your facilities nearby and the roads were horrific, but it wasn't scary, all right? And then in 1987, amazing development happened. A yeshiva came to the community, and that became really one of the main sources of community's growth, because it a very popular yeshiva, Bible school in Israel, became a Hesder yeshiva, which means there's a 5-year program, and the young men can go there. It's a 5-year program that combines the compulsory military service in the middle with the Bible study before and after. Boys who are in a Hesder yeshiva program, rather than being in the military for 3 years, are only on active military duty for 1.5 years. So they gain that actual extra 1.5 years instead of military service, studying Bible at the government's expense, which is really quite neat. And then they have extra time before and after for a total of 5 years. And they come out really, really dedicated in their faith and their commitment to the land of Israel. And many of these young men, when they finished the program, stayed. They would get married, and they stayed in Othniel. And so that has been the way it has grown. Unfortunately, though, in recent years, they have had some very serious terrorist attacks. First of all, going back to 2000 and Oslo and all the different changes that happened in the area, the road that Othniel was on actually became a much more isolated road because they created a much bigger bypass road that encompassed most of the other communities in the southern Hebron Hills area, with the exception of two communities that remain much more isolated. One is Beit Haggai, further to the east, and Othniel, further to the west. And they are the only two communities on this particular road. And let me tell you, I'm on that road fairly often, and it's not a fun road. Okay, you feel isolated. There's a lot of Arabs around. There's a lot of Palestinian towns, villages in that area. And as you're driving on that road, you really feel vulnerable. You really feel alone. And particularly if you're in Othniel and you're going to go from Othniel west, for example, if you're going from there to Beersheba, okay, which isn't that far, then it's only a very small part of that road, and it doesn't feel so isolated. But if you need to go from Othniel to Jerusalem, and traditionally Othniel was always felt more connected to Jerusalem, but if you're going to go on that road from Othniel to Jerusalem, you're driving east, and there's this whole stretch of road where you're feeling very, very uncomfortable. Now, add to that in recent years, there have been some really horrific terrorist attacks on this community. It actually went back to 2002. It's not that recent, but it's something that really changed things. There was an attack on the yeshiva itself on a Shabbat, and the boys were in the yeshiva, and terrorists came in to the dining room. And what happened was they entered through the kitchen, and there were a bunch of boys in the kitchen, and they killed 4 of them, injured others. But there was a couple of those boys that ended up blocking the doorway to the dining room and enabled the boys in the dining room, which of course where hundreds of boys were, to escape. And that was a horrible, horrible event that really, when terrorists come into your community, what that does for you is just horrific. Then it was quiet for a while. In 2016, a young woman, Daphne Meir, was murdered at the entrance to her home. You may have remembered that. She was literally in front of her front door painting her door. Her teenage daughter was right there, and terrorists came up and just murdered her. And in the years since then, there were also a number of other terrorist attacks. There was a man named Mickey Mark who was worked in the yeshiva, also lived in Othniel, and was murdered on the road very close to Othniel. So those years, I would say, especially between 2016 and 2019, very, very difficult time for the community. There was a lot of fear. And as a result, when I was in the community just a few weeks ago, I mean, I love the people there. They're great. But I got the sense of not despair, not at all, but of ongoing challenge. And I finally asked them, I said, have you grown at all in the last few years? And they said, not at all. Not at all. Because these terrorist attacks have scared people away. And they have it such a hard time. And again, what I described, that road, that, most of the people coming down to Othniel, they'll come from the other communities in Judea. They'll come from Jerusalem. They'll come from Gush Etzion. Driving that road, that is really hard. And it just frightens people. And if they have a choice to go to a community that doesn't feel so scary and driving on that road, they will go to one of those communities instead. So that's just, the people there are wonderful, and, we're trying to help them. They have, very serious needs. We just helped them with a fire station. They had serious fires right at the edge of their community this past summer, and they didn't have a fire engine. And now, thank God, we've given them the funding to hopefully they will have their fire engine very soon. So there are things that we're doing and that you're doing to help them. But I just wanted to, give you a sense. That's Othniel. It's pray for them and keep them in your thoughts, because they are really very, very special people who are living there. And I just want to end with one thought. I don't know if any of you are aware, but today is the 10th day of Tevet, the 10th day of the 10th month of the Hebrew calendar, and it is actually a fast day. So I'm actually fasting I mean, it's not a very long fast day. It finishes at 5 o'clock, so it's really not a big deal. But it is a fast day, and it's a fast day because it's a day that commemorates something that happened a long time ago. And it's actually from the Bible. It's mentioned both in Jeremiah 39 and in 2 Kings 25. And it commemorates the day that Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, first lay siege to Jerusalem during the First Temple period. And in 2 Kings 25, we read, and the 9th year to his reign, okay, we're talking about the reign of the king of Nebuchadnezzar. In the 10th month, on the 10th of the month, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came, he and his entire army, on Jerusalem. They camped, they lay siege to it, and they built a dike, a wall surrounding it, and they placed the city under siege, okay, for 2 years, actually. And this was the event that we commemorate today when we fast, because it is the first of 4 different fasts that are related to the destruction of the first temple. The first one is today, the 10th day of the 10th month, the 10th day of Tevet, which is the day that Nebuchadnezzar first came up to Jerusalem and lay siege. The second one is the 17th of Tammuz, the 17th of the 4th month, and that is when the Babylonians broke through the walls of Jerusalem. The third one is on the 9th of Av, the 9th of the 5th month, and that's the day that the temple was destroyed, and on that same day, the second temple was destroyed. And the last fast, the 4th fast, is in the 7th month. It's on the 3rd day of the 7th month. It actually commemorates something that happened on Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is the 1st and 2nd days of the 2nd month, 1st and 2nd days of Tishrei, and it was actually then that Gedaliah, son of Achikam, the last governor of Judea under the Babylonians, was murdered, and that sort of ended all hope of even a semi-autonomous reign in Jerusalem under the Babylonians. Those are the 4 fasts. And what I'd like to just kind of point out, the fasts themselves are the actual days of what happened are noted in Scripture, but I want to talk about the fasts themselves and end with this thought. Zechariah actually mentions, not just mentions these fast days, but put forth a very interesting question. Zechariah 7, verses 3 to 5, a question is raised, okay? And the question is raised, and I'll read it from verse 3. Shall I cry, or shall I mourn in the 5th day, as I have done on the 5th month, as I have done for all these years? Okay, the 5th month again is the fast day commemorating the destruction of the temple. And the question is this: Zechariah is at the beginning of the second temple period. He is of that generation that comes back to Israel and begins the second temple period. So he is roughly 70 years after the destruction of the first temple. And the question is arising. For 70 years, we have been mourning the destruction of the temple on the 5th month. Now that we are back in Israel and we are rebuilding the temple, should we continue mourning that day? It's an excellent question. And then we have God's answer. God says as follows: tell all the nations of the land and the priests, you are the ones who have fasted and mourned on the 5th month and on the 7th month for these 70 years. Have I fasted? This is what God says. What's God's answer? First of all, it talks about 2 fasts here, the 5th and the 7th month. The 5th, which is the 9th of Av, when the temple was destroyed. The 7th, which is that fast that mourns the murder of Gedaliah and the end of final autonomy in Jerusalem under the Babylonians. So it mentions those 2 fast days. But what God is saying, he says, why are you asking me? I don't fast on these days. You fast on these days. This needs to be your decision. But then in chapter 8, Zechariah comes back, and there's another prophecy about this that adds very interesting light. Okay, Zechariah 8, verse 19. So says the Lord of hosts, the fast of the 4th month, the fast of the 5th month, the fast of the 7th month, and the fast of the 10th month. That's today. will be for the house of Judah, joy and happiness. They will be for holidays, and truth and peace will be loved. Now, if you notice, there is no answer to this question. What this is a promise. God holds out a promise and says there will come a time when these 4 days will become days of holiday and rejoicing. And the question that remains, we have no idea what they ended up doing during the Second Temple period. Their theories. Did they fast or didn't they fast during the Second Temple period? I don't know. But this question has arisen today in modern Israel. The question is, okay, we're back in our land. We have an independent state. We are finally in a position where we are erasing the terrible exile and the destruction of the temple and all that came with it, whether the first temple or the second temple. Should we be fasting these 4 fasts? Okay. And God has made it clear it's up to us. Okay. And the question, and I would put forward this thing, if we have not abolished these fasts, we fast them. We fast them even as we question, should we be fasting them? As we question some of the prayers that we say, for example, on the 9th of Av, which is a very serious day of mourning, and it includes, some of the prayers includes texts that are impossible to say today. The traditional prayers would say, and we rent our clothes to see the streets of Jerusalem empty and all the buildings burnt. Who can say that? Jerusalem today is beautiful and it's full of children. And if you think of Zechariah's prophecy that comes just afterwards in chapter 8, when he talks about how, again, the old people will see the young people dancing through, the old people will sit and watch and enjoy the young people dancing in the streets of Jerusalem. This is a prophecy that we are seeing being fulfilled today. Okay. So what should we do? Should we fast or not? And I think God leaves it in our hands. And what we face today is this ongoing kind of pendulum. Okay. On the one hand, there's no comparison, our situation today with what went before us for 2,000 years of exile. We are in such a much better place. We're on the way towards final redemption, but we haven't gotten there yet. We're not in the final redemption. And for this, I feel, therefore, that it's so interesting to me. I wish I knew what they did in the Second Temple period, because the Second Temple period was not ideal. And you know what? Let's be honest. The First Temple period was not ideal. It was never ideal. Even in its heyday, Solomon, the first few years of the temple, Solomon was probably as good as it got. Okay, what happened after Solomon? The kingdom split. There was division. There was idolatry. There was so many problems. I mean, you read all of the book of Kings and Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel. There is and the minor prophets. And there's so much that you can see was wrong about the First Temple period. And we know from history there was so much wrong with the Second Temple period. And so the question is, do you wait for it to be perfect? Or is it enough to say, look how far we've gotten, we no longer need to fast? And I think what has happened in the way we are today, and I don't know if it's the right way to do it, but what's happened in fact is, on the one hand, we celebrate Independence Day as a religious holiday. We sing songs of praise to God. And it is not just a national holiday, it's a religious holiday. And it's infused with all the religious spirit of thanks and appreciation. On the one hand, but on the other hand, we're still fasting because we know, what did I just talk about today? Terrorism, Iran, all these issues. We are certainly not at a point where we can say we're sitting back on our laurels and we're each man under his fig tree, enjoying peace and quiet. We're certainly not there either. So there is this ongoing stress, kind of tension between these two things. And maybe that's where we need to be, in that tension between the two. And then, maybe that's where we need to be, constantly straining for yearning and moving towards what we know will be the ultimate goal, and when Messiah will come, and we truly will have full redemption and peace in our land and peace all over the world. So that's my message for you today. And I'd love to hear from you guys. Open your mics. Let me know what's on your mind.
Because some of us feel, Sondra, that as us Christians start partnering, and continue to partner with you Israelis, that's when these fast days can be turned into happy days.
Well, that's certainly part. I do believe very, very strongly that all this new movement of Christians standing with Jews is part of this redemption process. No question. Yeah. No question.
Yes. Yeah. Mm. Any questions?
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sure.
Sondra, I don't know if you saw my message, but you've done lots of different short videos about the communities in Judea and Samaria. Did you have one on Othniel? I can't remember. I mean, I've watched a lot, but I can't remember.
I don't know, but I will check it out because I don't remember. I mean, there's an ongoing project. We're constantly doing new communities. Every month, you're going to get a new one. I can guarantee you that if we didn't do Othniel yet, we will do it soon. But I'll check that out and I'll send you an email if we did do it already with the link.
Yeah, thank you.
Did you have a son that lives there, Sondra?
That lives in Othniel?
That did?
No, I never had. It turns out all four of my sons went to the same yeshiva in the Gush Etzion area. One of them did go down to Othniel when he was in high school to check it out, to see if he would want to go there, but decided instead to go to the same yeshiva his brothers had gone to, which was in Gush Etzion. But I have a nephew who was at that yeshiva. And there's a few people, I mean, Jeremy Gimpel?
Oh, yeah.
He was at that yeshiva.
Ah, brave boy.
Yeah. Great place. It's a lovely yeshiva.
That's good, Sondra, because while you were talking, I just thought of Jeremy and Ari, and that we've talked about them together before, and Our Good Farm. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, us Christians here are discovering that we need a lot more encouragement from each other than we did pre-COVID. We've gone through a lot of trials in all the nations, and I'm sure you agree with that. You gravitate to those who are on the same page, particularly in your Zionist forum. I don't know, probably speaking out of turn, but and it's wonderful that you just said Jeremy went to the yeshiva there. So I guess he's possibly aware of the feeling down there, although both Ari and Jeremy have had their own challenges and it really consumes them from day to day. But I guess what I'm saying is encouraging an invitation for them to go down and just get with them and really what we call in Christianity, exhort each other's spirit higher in hope, of why you're there and with no doubt, God is in your midst, even on the worst days. So that's just my little thing. It's really good to.
I think what you're saying makes a lot of sense, but I just want to put it in context. I selected one community to focus on, but there's a lot of communities with a lot of different stories. Yeah. And as you mentioned, Jeremy and Ari are dealing with their own issues in the Arab farm. And so I think that the way I see it, I think that all of the communities in Judea and Samaria feel an enormous sense of camaraderie with one another.
Good. Yeah.
And we believe a tremendous sense of unity and solidarity within the country itself. But
on the best of days, it's
but going
together you do it, don't you?
But yes, a sense of solidarity. There is. In fact, as we've visited the communities, I've thought they can really show us how to do community. Those people, they're amazing. Everyone knows everybody else and, look out for each other. know when the babies are born, when people are married.
I'll just say that I think you're right about Joy, about it's beautiful to know that the camaraderie between the communities in Israel is strong. But I think that is a massive lesson for all of us here in this nation. There's a sifting, there's a shaking. God's promises are yes and amen. And we keep praying and praying for the peace of Jerusalem and just, be there for these precious people.
Yes.
And just in passing, just watch this space in USA. There's going to be change in the not too distant future.
Good change, Diana?
Well, I can't. Well, I think there's going to be change.
Yes.
We're not having an incompetent leader for much longer.
That would be
Let's
good.
leave it there. I mean, it made me weep when I saw, whatever you think of the man, it's about God's choice ultimately, isn't it? When we saw Trump at the Western Wall, whatever your thoughts are, I just thought, yeah. But unity is absolutely key. Looking out for one another, caring for one another. It's a world lesson over the nations.
Amen.
And good to see you, Sondra. I got there eventually.
Sondra, you mentioned Iran particularly. What do you think about the other nations that are mentioned in Ezekiel 38 and verse 5? Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya. Is there any concern in Israel at the present moment about what that might mean?
Okay, well, first of all, I think that there are parts of put this way, parts of Ezekiel apply to the future, part of it applies to the current time. And I would be very hesitant in assuming that every time a particular country is mentioned. I mean, don't forget, when it's talking about Gog and Magog, there never was a country called Gog and Magog, and we don't know of a country called Gog and Magog today. So clearly those names were chosen because they're going to be representing powerful enemies, and we'll assign the names Gog and Magog to them when we figure out who they are, okay? But then when he talks about Persia, Ethiopia, and Put, I don't even know what Put is. These are countries that, Ethiopia, for example, Ethiopia is not a powerful country today. They don't pose any kind of challenge to Israel in any way. Persia, on the other hand, is Iran and poses a huge challenge. But I'm not sure if we're meant to take these countries literally as meaning those countries today, because, this is a different situation, and Ezekiel was speaking to the people of his time, not only to the people of our time. So, I would just take that all and say, I think when whatever happens, then we'll understand how to look forward and figure it out from there.
Yeah, thank you, Sondra. Just that you mentioned Iran particularly, and I wondered whether there's any concern in Israel today about the others. But thank you very much.
Iran is Iran. Yes. Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Graham.
Of that we can be certain. Thank you, Sondra.
Okay.
Sondra, I just wondered, what's the general morale for the people in Israel at the moment with this Iranian sort of acceleration of things? Is there anxiety, or are people just so used to all of this terror and awful stuff that they just shrug their shoulders and think another thing? Like, I pray, so I just wondered, how are the children? Are they feeling frightened? Or do people just get up in the morning?
I think if the kinds of things that are more produce more anxiety are these knifing attacks, and because you'll see that on TV, it has a very real look. Okay, if you see someone being stabbed as he's crossing the street in Jerusalem, so that might create anxiety for you when you cross the street in Jerusalem. When you're in Jerusalem, and that will last for a few days, and then it will kind of dissipate, because it is a reality that we're all very used to, unfortunately, and you learn to live with it. And the anxiety is produced because of, you can see and understand very real life activities. Iran is so huge and so horrible that it's very hard for most people to get their heads around it. I can't get my head around it. Whenever I read this stuff, I say, oh, God, I'm leaving it to you, and I can't even say I'm leaving it to Bibi or Bennett or whoever, because I know that as heads of state, and they're running the Mossad, and the Mossad has done amazing things, and its tentacles have gone right into Iran in ways that are amazing, and that's amazing that they're doing this and they have the capabilities. But even that is not going to solve the problem. It is so huge. And so I like what you said. People shrug their shoulders and say, "Well, God, fix it, or take care of it, or protect me, and then let's move on." And so I think we have to be aware of it. We can't. Our political leaders can't afford to shrug their shoulders, because they are responsible for doing whatever needs to be done, no question. But we as ordinary citizens, it's just too big for us.
Sure. So I saw Gantz in America and sort of a big PR thing, talking to the defense secretary or whatever, and new measures of putting their experimental whatevers into place with all of their ammunition and airplanes and stuff. And I'm just thinking, is that a very real thing over Israel's airspace? Are the people hearing these planes constantly? Is it a lot of stress? Or where do they do all these exercises?
It's very funny. So first of all, the Negev is where most of the air maneuvers happen, because it's very relatively large areas that are unpopulated. But I have to tell you, last week we were in the office and we heard this noise in the sky, and I said to my fellow co-workers, both of whom are relatively new in Israel, I said, "Oh, that was a fighter plane. That's a maneuver." And they go, "Oh, really? Oh my gosh." I said, "Yeah, you hear it, happens, And they were like, "Oh, really? Oh my gosh, So, you hear that stuff every so often. Okay, what's going on.
Fair enough. You're very brave and courageous.
I don't feel that way. I feel that first of all, I have a wonderful life, and I have a life that's full of meaning. I have a life that's full of love and family and faith, and it's definitely not boring.
I'm so glad.
And I'm not by myself. There's all of us doing this, and so you could say, well, if we're brave, then everybody's brave. So then you don't feel like it's anything unusual, really. But I guess from the perspective of somebody out there, definitely. When I start telling these things, I say, "Ooh."
And we have the privilege of knowing you. Marion, did you have any last words?
Well, not really, but I've been thinking about King Hezekiah. One of my favorite stories, when the king of Assyria started to besiege Jerusalem, Judah, and he didn't know what to do. And he did what you're doing, Sondra. He took the letter from the king of Assyria and he took it into the temple and he laid it on the altar. And I've never forgotten that. It's just like what you said. Here's what is written, and I have got no clue what to do about it. And of course, the story goes and tells us that when they woke up the next day, 85,000 of the Assyrians were dead. The Lord had sent a fighting angel consignment. And I thought, what about getting every yeshiva to write a letter to the Lord and putting it up and saying, here we are. Well, you're the covenant keeping Israeli Jewish people are his delight, and we all love Daniel because he's a picture of someone who would not be deterred regardless, and really over history, you as the Jewish people have faced many, many great odds, even in the forming of the nation. The wonderful DVDs most of us have probably watched, Against All Odds. And, the Lord himself is going to complete everything he said he would. It's just a bit daunting sometimes when you feel like you're actually living in the middle of some big stuff that could be happening. But, you know, the end of the story is that he is going, as you believe too, and we do too, that Messiah will come. And it just delights us to know covenant-keeping people that God is really watching out for and over for. And, you know, my heart is always warm to know that through the centuries, he said, you know, the Shabbat will be a sign between you and me, and it's never gone away. And these are the things we all need to keep reminding ourselves. I agree with you when you said, you know, you just get over hearing what I would call the bad report, you know, like the 10 spies gave a bad report. I want the 2 spies that want to give the good report, you know, and they believe God. So we want to just be listening like you do to your fellow Jewish people who really are on your page. And yes, it may look you know, insurmountable out there, but God has it. God has it. He never didn't have it. He does it in incredible ways that we would not have even foreknew. You know, just simply having gone through the story of Joseph again recently. So, Sondra, keep doing what you are doing.
Thank you.
Except you know, maybe it's time to get Bennett and his wife for a Shabbat meal and tell him, you know, you've got these Christians on your back saying, come on, tell him to let us back in. You know, put in a word.
No, that's a completely separate issue because that's the COVID thing. But I know that Bennett appreciates Christian support greatly. I can tell you that Bennett was in my office years ago before he went into politics. And I told him all about CFOIC and he thought it was great.
Great. It'd be a good idea to remind him. He needs some new focus on something else. But anyway, Sondra, again, thanks for giving us the time. You are really quite honoured and respected in all of our lives here this evening and others who haven't been able to make it tonight. I want to personally thank Joy for her consistent loyalty to the organisation, and you know, she doesn't stop. She's always on the ball and recruiting this one and that one to do this one and the other thing, and never moving out of her lounge room, really. So you know, the internet's really gone up in all its use. So again, Sondra, we're going into what a lot of people call the time of remembering Jesus' birth. A lot of us don't believe that date, but just to all of you out there, just wanting to bless you all, and may you have a joyful, it's good news to all men, and a peaceful time. And remember that the Lord God Almighty reigns.
Amen.
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 Okay.
Thank
you
you.
so much. And
Yes.
for those of you who celebrate, have a very Merry Christmas.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank you.
for coming,
Lots of love,
everybody.
Sondra.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Lots of love.
Okay.
Bye.
God bless.
Bye.
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 Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed that video, and we'd like to be sure you're getting all of our video content. So just click on the subscribe button below, as well as on the notification bell, and that way you will have easy access to all our material. We look forward to staying in touch with you. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.